Okay, well, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending upon where you're joining us from. I welcome all of our Boston University friends and family members. And I want to, before we get started, to let you know that closed captioning is available. So if you go to the bottom of your screen, you'll see the button that says closed caption. Click on that small arrow and then click to show the subtitles, and they'll pop up on your screen throughout this presentation. And Dr. McKee has offered to entertain questions at the end of this session. So either type your question in the Q&A or the chat, but we will hold those all till the end of her presentation. So with that, I will turn this over to Dean Elmore. Thank you.
Well, it's good to know that there are many of you out there, and your presence is something that I certainly appreciate. I have the honor of introducing Dr. Ann McKee, and I love that Dr. McKee is one of those folks who can walk around the earth saying, well, how do I introduce myself? Am I a School of Medicine BU faculty member, or am I just one of Time Magazine's 100 most influential people? I mean, you know, I hope I can get to that day where I could juggle off those kinds of accolades. Dr. McKee, as you know, will discuss her research on brain injuries, and many of you know that she researches how those brain injuries can lead to chronic traumatic encephalopathy. I think I got it right there. And she's also well known for her work with military veterans, the NHL, NFL for sure, we know that, and most recently the NHL. So it's my pleasure to listen and hear from Dr. Ann McKee. Welcome.
Thank you, Ken. I'm delighted to be here. And I am going to talk a little bit about CTE. It's what we've been working on. I don't have screen sharing, is that right? I thought I was going to be able to share my screen.
I can absolutely give you that.
Yeah, I'd like to share my screen. And so I'm going to go through what I consider to be the updates in CTE, and then talk about our most recent research papers. I'm still having trouble sharing my screen.
Let's see.
It says host disabled.
Oh no. Okay, see if that will work.
Oh, that worked.
Fantastic.
Okay, so here we go with updates in CTE. Here we go. So just before I begin this talk, I'd like to point out that for most of my life, I was an enormous football fan. And when I started this work, I was, a rabid NFL watcher. My team was the Green Bay Packers because I was born right outside of Green Bay, Wisconsin. And I was born in the Lombardi era for Super Bowl I and II. This is my dad. He played football for Grinnell. These are my brothers who played for Lawrence University, a local college in my town. And even they had me playing football at the age of 2 or whatever that is. So football is something I understand. It was part of my upbringing. It's part of my culture. I adored football. But what I realize now more recently is that I adore football players, and I care about them and their health and safety a great deal. And that has really led to this work. So CTE is not a new disease. It was described actually originally almost 100 years ago by a pathologist who described the clinical symptoms in boxers. And he wrote that up as a paper called Punch Drunk back in 1928. My first experience with CTE was also in a boxer. This is the first case I diagnosed with CTE at Boston University. This was the case of Paul Pender, and I can say his name with family's complete consent. He was a very well-known boxer in the Boston area. He'd been a world champion twice over. He was also a US Marine, and he had developed severe dementia. He had come to my attention through the Alzheimer's Disease Center. I did the brain autopsies for the Alzheimer's Disease Center. In fact, Alzheimer's disease was my main focus of research for most of my career up until about 12 years ago. And he was diagnosed during life with Alzheimer's disease. But when I saw his brain at autopsy, it was clear he had anything but Alzheimer's. And he had this very curious deposition of tau protein throughout his brain in a pattern that really, knocked me out. I'd never seen anything like it. It was quite extraordinary to me. And when you're looking at thousands and thousands of brains over the course of your career, you get to know the nuances and the rarities. But this was something the likes of which I'd never encountered before. And the tau protein, which is evident as this dark brown color inside nerve cells, you can see it forms little circles or ringlets around small blood vessels. It hugs the side of blood vessels, and that's something quite unique to CTE that's not seen in any other disorder. And so that was fascinating to me. And I immediately started to study other boxers. They were few and far between, but I was very interested in this disease in boxers. And then back in 2008, so some 5 years later, quite coincidentally, I met an individual named Chris Nowinski, who was a WWE wrestler. And well, his story is quite extraordinary. I won't go into it today, but Chris is the one who asked me if I'd be willing to look at the brains of football players. And because of my intense interest in what had happened to the boxers, I immediately said yes. And that started this very long, what has been a wild ride through science and medicine, politics, and big business. So our first cases of football players whose brains were donated to Boston University were both Tom McHale and John Grimsley. They were our first and second case. Both of them had been players in the NFL for 9 years. Both died from an accident at age 45. And both of them had some very subtle changes. Nothing clearly obvious, just something that their wives had been concerned about, but didn't know what to make of. And when we looked at the brains of these 45-year-olds, we saw in their brains the same tau protein doing those same very strange configurations around blood vessels. And I was blown away. First of all, as a rabid football fan, I was shocked to see that these 45-year-olds, young men by my standards, had a devastating neurologic disease. I was horrified to think that it might be from football, but it looked in every way identical to what had happened to the boxer. The only distinction was it was slightly less severe, but these individuals had died some 30 years younger than Paul Pender. So not surprising that it wasn't severe. But this was my epiphany. This was my wake-up call. I remember saying to my brother, we've got to contact the NFL. They'll be horrified to know that this exists. And little did we know how naive that statement was. But this was the beginning. Because I had been developing a brain bank with Alzheimer's disease for many years, first at Mass General, and then when I came to Boston University, the first thing I did was set up a brain bank. And back in 2008, we had those 2 cases, but you can see now we have over 1,000 brain donors. It's actually an incredibly robust acquisition of brains. We get 2 to 5 a week. It's been extraordinary. I started out with 2 technicians and myself. We rapidly expanded to 2 more technicians, and now we have about 30 employees. I have 3 other neuropathologists. It's developed into a huge enterprise. So what is CTE? It's a neurodegenerative disease of the brain. It's found in athletes and military veterans with a history of repetitive brain trauma. And everyone is focused on concussions, but more importantly, CTE is triggered by repetitive small hits to the brain, what we call subconcussive hits, the kind that a player plays through without even realizing that his brain has been hit or that he's had a brain injury. And it's estimated that a single football player suffers between 500 and 1,500 of these subconcussive hits per season. So you can only imagine what a 10-year career has brought. CTE is defined by the pattern of tau deposition, this protein in the brain. It cannot be diagnosed during life with certainty. It can only be diagnosed after death by neuropathologic exam. And of course, that's something that we're working on. We want to be able to diagnose this disease during life. The criteria for diagnosing this disease during after death, we provided in a publication of ours in 2013. This is where we pointed out that the tau protein in this disorder is circles around small blood vessels, and that it occurs in these distinct areas of the brain. You'll see it's where the gray matter or the cortex dives in. We get these clusters of abnormalities. Very unusual, very unlike any other disorder, including Alzheimer's disease. In that same publication, we published what we call the staging of CTE, how it goes from mild CTE to more severe CTE. And those were the 4 stages of CTE pathology. They correlate with age at death, meaning the individuals that are older when they die tend to have higher stage CTE. And importantly, they also correlate with the length of a football career. So the longer you play football and the older you are when you die, the higher or more severe your CTE. This is a graph from a publication just this year. It was done by some Chinese scientists who looked at the publications in CTE over the last 25 years. And they drew attention to 2 inflection points where the interest in CTE really took off, and that was 2009 and 2013. And those 2 years coincide with the publications of the BU CTE Center publications on CTE. So, and as they say over and over in this particular publication, it's the BU CTE Center that leads the field in CTE. Now, just a minute to explain why we think the tau is deposited in those crevices of the brain and around blood vessels. And very simply, it's the physics of the injury. That's where the brain has the most stress and tension with those repetitive hits. There's the most damage to the brain around small blood vessels and at the crevices of the brain. This is probably our most impactful paper. This was from 2017. I think this surprised the world. It certainly surprised us that it got so much attention. But this was the paper where we described 202 American football players whose brains were donated for research. And in this very biased subset, that is, it's a brain donor sample. This is not a study of the general prevalence in the world. In this biased brain donor sample, of the 111 brains that we'd received from former NFL players, nearly all of them showed CTE, which was shocking to us and shocking to the world. But importantly, and something that doesn't get as much attention, we've seen it now in hundreds. Back in 2017, it was 48, but now it's in the hundreds. We have hundreds of former college players. So this isn't just a professional level public health hazard. This is something that affects college athletes and even sometimes high school athletes. Again, this wasn't a prevalence study. This was a case report of what we had experienced in the brain bank. We got a lot of pushback about this study from hostile groups, many of whom were championed by connections to major sports leagues. but just a small sampling of some of the press that we received after this JAMA publication, pointing out that there was no causal link between concussions and CTE. That's true. In fact, about 20% of our cases of CTE have never had concussion, but repeatedly, over and over, the length of playing career or the cumulative number of subconcussive hits is associated with risk and severity for CTE. The media attention to this issue outweighs any meaningful results from sound experimental science. Why does McKee make sweeping assertions based on anecdotes and not a randomized study? Football is good for us, deception surely isn't. Other scientists do not replicate McKee's findings, major problem when you want to call your work science. And saying McKee found CTE in all but one football corpse may say something about football, but it may say something about McKee. And then about a year later, we had this book come out called Brainwashed, The Bad Science Behind CTE and the Plot to Destroy Football, published by Dr. Pete Cummings, also at Boston University, and Merrill Hodge, a former NFL player. And in this book, the science behind football and CTE is mostly garbage. Those perivascular lesions are man-made. They accuse me of fraud. Selection bias makes the infamous 10 out of 100 brains almost worthless, and science that's just plain terrible. Anyway, last year we published another paper, and in this paper we accounted for all the bias in the brain bank. We used very, very complicated statistics, simulation and inverse probability weighting, and after all of these statistics were said and done, what we knew from looking at the record of 266 football players and the years that they had played football, we found that the risk of developing CTE increased by 30% for every year played, or in other words, for every 2.6 years of football, the odds of developing CTE double. We found that individuals who play less than 4.5 years were 10 times less likely to develop CTE, and those who play more than 14.5 years were 10 times more likely to develop CTE. So these aren't absolute guidelines, but they're flexion points. You're very unlikely to get CTE if you play less than 5 years, and likely to get CTE if you play more than 14.5. So reporters asked Tom Brady, "Are you worried about CTE?" And his answer, "First of all, I've been doing it for a long time, so your body gets used to the hits. My brain understands the position you are putting your body into, and my brain is wired for contact. I would say in some ways it's become callous to some of the hits." So in my mind, this is wishful thinking and really off base. Just to give you an idea of, we have over 1,000 brain donors. I could never show you all their individual stories, which all are tragic, which all are worth talking about. But if we could look at some of those individuals, they're seen in this montage, and their brains are shown here just as a montage of what their brains would look like. I'm only going to show you one case because it was recently the subject of a Netflix documentary, and you may be very aware of this case. But the case is Aaron Hernandez, who was a 27-year-old former New England Patriots. And this is a brain that has also come into our brain bank. Let me just play a little bit of the documentary.
No one has allegedly murdered 2 people and then played an entire season as a professional athlete.
I can't wait to be free.
Aaron Hernandez from Bristol, Connecticut. I play at Bristol Central High School.
Aaron Hernandez was a different level of athlete.
He was kind.
He wasn't someone who picked on other kids.
He's one of the best players in America. Give him the ball.
The Patriots reward him with a $40 million contract. Aaron Hernandez was a ticking time bomb. The
why is the story here?
He was out to prove something, like a tough guy all the time.
He had a second residence.
The flop house. He had trouble with drugs, guns.
Aaron was absolutely operating on the edge.
Would have exploded.
New England Patriot Aaron Hernandez was arrested this morning at his residence.
I won't go through the rest of it, but as you know, he was convicted of murdering Odin Lloyd, and then 2 years later acquitted for another double homicide. And several days after his acquittal in the second court battle, he took his own life in prison. So his brain did come to our laboratory, and this is just a view of the laboratory as we take in brains. When we first looked at the brain, it looked entirely normal, but when we did the coronal dissection, it became immediately apparent that this was not a normal brain. It looked normal on the surface, but when we looked at it in dissection, we could see that he had clear damage to some internal structures of his brain that were very unusual to see in such a young man. And we could actually see perforations or holes in this internal membrane. And I'd never before seen anything like it in a 20-some-year-old. The youngest person I'd ever seen with fenestrations in this membrane previously was a 45-year-old former rugby player with CTE. And then when we looked under the microscope, we saw tremendous abnormalities, tau in nerve cells, hugging these small blood vessels, and they were everywhere. They were in the frontal cortex, the temporal cortex, the amygdala, the infraparietal cortex. They were just about everywhere we looked. These were classic perivascular lesions of CTE. There was no doubt to the diagnosis. There were no other injuries to the brain. There were no other disorders in the brain. It was pure CTE. It involved most of his frontal cortex. The frontal cortex runs from about here to here. And you can see even at this, this is a naked eye resolution, you can see that at least half of his frontal cortex is affected by disease. It was really truly extraordinary to see this level of disease in such a young player. And we diagnosed him with stage 3 CTE. So what did that diagnosis indicate? And here I'm just going to quote from Bob Holler from the Boston Globe. It was evidence that football's brutality may have consequence not just for NFL retirees, but active players in their 20s and maybe even younger. My diagnosis, that her diagnosis, introduced a controversial possibility that Aaron Hernandez had committed suicide in part because he had a severe neurologic injury, a brain so scarred by recurring head trauma that it could help explain his troubling behavior, possibly including his criminal acts. While Hernandez's dramatic unraveling was connected, whether Hernandez's dramatic unraveling was connected to CTE remains one of the great mysteries of his life, and it may be unanswerable. While alive, Hernandez displayed hallmark symptoms of the disease: poor judgment, lack of impulse control, anger, paranoia. But there were other powerful forces at play that could have influenced his behavior. And then he goes on to talk about drugs and the criminal individuals that he was involved with. And then there was a opinion piece in the New York Times written by several law professors. Is CTE a defense for murder? We now know there was substantial evidence that Mr. Hernandez should not have been convicted of first-degree murder. Given the conclusive diagnosis of stage 3 CTE, it is likely that a lifetime of playing football, not Mr. Hernandez's will, was to blame. So I'll just leave those thoughts with you and you can make up your own mind. But I did think it was an instructive case. We've seen it in other sports, hockey, soccer. This is one of the youngest soccer players we've seen it in, Patrick Grange, died at the age of 29, had CTE in his brain, was also diagnosed with ALS, and that is an association that we're actively pursuing, the association of CTE with motor neuron disease. We have about 26 people in the brain bank with this combination of disease. So what's the scope of the problem? There are about 20 million current and former high school and college contact sport athletes. There are about 20,000 current and former NFL players. And in terms of veterans who've been exposed to these types of injuries, it's about 360,000. What do we need to do? First of all, we need to be able to diagnose it in the living. We need to determine if there's a critical threshold. Should we limit the number of years played? Should we start people playing these games at a older age? We've got to identify genetic susceptibility factors. And we, of course, have to develop treatments. But the treatments really depend on being able to detect it in the living, because we can't determine a treatment efficacy unless we can monitor the disease during life. The fact that we have no way to monitor the disease, we have no real way to judge a potential therapy. And then, of course, there's prevention, safe practice, better care of head injuries. And then I'm going to go, I'm sorry I've talked so long, but I was just going to go through some of our last year's worth of publications. This is an important paper written by Mike Alasko in our group talking about white matter. We're still not exactly sure why some of these individuals have these wide mood swings and these very disabling behavioral changes of anger, volatility. We're not sure why they get such depression with suicidal thoughts. We think it's probably not all the tau that's in the brain, although the tau does correlate with dementia. We're trying to understand some of these early symptoms, and we think that the white matter may be injured as well during these subconcussive hits. And this was a paper of Dr. Alasko's where he showed that the white matter loss, the loss of axons in the white matter was correlated with dementia in the football players. It was also correlated with how long they played. And we think that this may give us a clue as to what some of the underlying causes of some of those behavioral and mood changes are. We're looking at genetic modifiers. We know that ApoE4 is associated with increased severity of CTE. If you get CTE, it's associated with worse tau deposition and dementia, but it isn't associated with, per se, with increased risk. So you don't get CTE based on your ApoE4, but if you have CTE, it is associated with a worse outcome. And then we have a TMEM106B, which is a gene that is associated with inflammation in the brain. Inflammation in the brain is something that we're very much pursuing, both as a reason that the disease gets worse over time and as a possible way to treat the disease. And what we found is that people who inherit this TMEM106B, if they inherit even one copy of it, when they get CTE, it tends to be less severe. So it appears to be a protective gene, that when they get it, they get less inflammation, less tau pathology, and are less likely to develop dementia. We also know that age is a modifier. Old age is associated with worse severity, and that things like high occupational attainment, doing something with your life, challenging your brain, expecting to and using your brain throughout your life is associated with resilience, not to the pathology, but to the symptoms of the disease. This is just some work looking at inflammation. We found that an unusual cytokine called CCL11, an inflammatory cytokine, is increased in the CNS or in the brain of individuals with CTE, but not Alzheimer's disease. And this is something we're following on to see if we can use it as a predictor of CTE during life. We're looking at blood or plasma to see if we can find a biomarker for CTE. So far, we haven't come up with a biomarker for CTE. This is a study, again by Michael Laska, where we looked for plasma tau levels, and there was a trend for higher tau. If you had more exposure to head impacts, you could see that the tau went up with the longer your playing career, but it didn't differentiate a symptomatic NFL player from a control. You can see there's huge overlap between these two. Even though the trend is higher, on an individual basis, you can't use it to distinguish a player with CTE from one who does not. The same is true for the tau imaging studies. This is using a ligand for tau to tag the tau, and then you do a scan, a PET scan, and it lights up areas in the brain that have tau. This was another study done in former NFL players. And again, the longer a player played, the more likely they were to get this tau in their brain, as seen on the floor tau Sapir scan. But it didn't distinguish an affected player from a normal person. Again, there was just too much variability between individuals. We know CTE is a unique disease. Back in the beginning, I was accused of making this disease up. It was a figment of my imagination, an imaginary construct. But now we've found that the tau protein in CTE is distinct from all other disease when you do cryo-EM. It's distinct from Alzheimer's disease. It's distinct from all other tauopathies. So this is great evidence that CTE is a unique disease. And then we've looked at individuals who've played sports from the Framingham Heart Study, which is also a Boston University study. And I think importantly, and this study I don't think got quite enough attention, what we found is that in former contact sport athletes that were in the Framingham study, even without the development of CTE, that those who played contact sports for over 8 years were more likely, they were 6 times more likely to get Parkinson's disease and Lewy body disease. That's in the absence of getting CTE. So that's important. It isn't just CTE, it's Lewy body disease and Parkinson's disease that these individuals are at risk for. We have a recent paper describing sleep abnormalities, what we call REM sleep behavior disorder. And we found that in a lot of individuals with CTE, especially individuals who played a long time. And we found that those individuals with CTE that develop this REM behavior disorder have tau in their brainstem, or they also have Parkinson's disease. So it's very common to see these two diseases together. This is a paper that was published at the end of the summer. We did a very sophisticated quantitative analysis of tau in 14 brain regions, and it validated our CTE staging scheme. In addition, this quantitative assessment of tau was associated with age at death, with number of years of play, and whether or not the individual became demented. So validating our previous work. And then this is sort of an interesting study I just happened upon yesterday. This is from China, where they looked at all the publications in CTE from 1999 to last year. And you can see that USA is at the epicenter of this literature, and Boston University is at the epicenter of the United States. They didn't realize that we also work at the VA Boston healthcare system, so they distinguished those two, but of course that's both of the institutions where I and the rest of my team work, and Emerson is where my colleague Dr. Cantu works. So I think we're overwhelmingly leading the field in this disease. So obviously we have a lot of work to do. This is just a snapshot of some young players who've taken their own life. We have over 100 young players in our brain bank who've taken their own life. That's a paper that we're currently putting together. 60% of them have been diagnosed with CTE, which is a very, very disturbing statistic. So understanding what is going wrong with these young individuals, seeing these tragedies. Every week, I see another tragedy. All I want to do is for this to stop. I want people to be really interested in CTE research so that we can discover ways to diagnose it in these individuals so they don't go on to be missed, to be lost to follow-up, and to take their own lives. This is just it isn't even all of us that work for the CTE Center. It takes a village. I have very dedicated research assistants and staff who work 100 hours a week doing this work. We're very grateful to them. And that's why we've been able to do so much in such a short time. And I want to thank our families, and I want to thank all our funding sources, the VA, NIH, the Department of Defense, the Andlinger Foundation, and historically we've gotten money from the NFL, WWE, and the National Operating Committee for Safety in Sports Equipment. So thank you very much. That's it.
Dr. McKee, thank you very much for sharing your research, for sharing some of these stories. I do want to open it up quickly, be mindful of your time, but if any of our parents or family members or friends have questions, please don't hesitate to type them in either the Q&A or the chat, and Dr. McKee will answer your questions. If not, I really want to thank you so much for your time and for your research and for the good work that you do for us all. I wonder how you stay positive during when you see cases. I believe you said that you see a new case every week. How do you stay positive? I know you're doing great work, so this doesn't continue, but it must be hard.
It is hard, and there's no question it's hard. Dealing with the families, the tragedy of losing a son, a brother, a dad, a spouse, it's overwhelming. And the guilt they feel often that they couldn't do anything, that they didn't recognize it, that they blamed them sometimes for misbehavior is really, it's extraordinary. And on top of all this, of course, we're fighting the battle against big business. There are many, many lawsuits. I am not involved in any litigation, but I become subpoenaed. Our work is subpoenaed constantly, and it's a constant battle. Fulfilling these subpoenas, providing depositions to the courts. And all of this is an attempt to destroy the integrity of our work. And so it can be very, it can be hard. But what keeps us going is the importance of the work and how much we want to stop it for the future generations, how much we want young athletes to stay safe, to be able to play their sports without worry. And that is just compelling all of us to move forward. So thank you.
I imagine it does. Thank you. Dr. McKee, just one last question. A parent has asked, have you found CTE in female athletes?
We have not to this date. It has been described in 2 females. We have a very low percentage of females coming into the brain bank. We have made all sorts of recruitment efforts to get more females. We collaborate with the Sports Legacy Institute, the Concussion Legacy Foundation, and we have female athletes, major soccer players like Brandy Chastain and Abby Wamba, who've pledged to donate their brains upon their death. We now have a couple dozen female athletes in the brain bank. We haven't finished. This is a running tally, right? And we're always playing catch up. So we haven't evaluated all those cases. But there are 2 described in the literature. We're very concerned about females. As you know, Title IX was a relatively recent development, so women my age didn't play sports. There weren't sports allowed, I wasn't allowed to play sports. even though I would have loved to. And also the military. Women aren't in the military until very recently. So there's a lag period before they catch up. But we're very concerned about women's health. We know that they're very susceptible to concussions and other brain injuries. We know that, in fact, a woman usually recovers more slowly from a concussion. We're not exactly sure if that's because of neck strength or something basic about the biology of the female brain. But we're concerned that the disease in females might even be more of a problem. So this is something we very much want to solve for the future.
Thank you, Doctor. Another parent has asked, if I may, is it possible for students to become involved in your research?
It is. It's tough for students, I'll tell you, because they have a lot of commitments, but we always do take a certain number of students. In general, it's medical students or people that are going into research. You have to be pretty serious because we, as much as we'd love to open it up to every student, the work is so intense and we're so busy that unless a student can really be willing to stay with us for a long time so that we haven't taught them and then they move on to something else, so that they can really be an effective contributor to the work, we certainly do take on students. We have all sorts of graduate medical students, we have doctoral students, and we do have some medical students right now. So it's really a matter of the individual.
Well, Dr. McKee, I thank you again for your presentation today, and I thank all of our parent, family members, and friends who have joined us. I really appreciate the time that you have dedicated to Family and Friends Weekend. Thank you so much.
You're welcome, and thank you for having me.
Take good care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.